What actually makes an army no skill in Clash of Clans? For most players, it's pretty simple. You get crushed by it, and it feels like the attacker didn't have to think even once. It feels effortless, unfair, and frustrating to defend against. But if we look at it objectively, a no-skill army is one where the skill floor is extremely low, there's very little planning involved, almost no adjustment based on base design, and execution usually comes down to spamming troops in a general direction and letting raw stats do the work. And more often than not, you're still walking away with at least 2 stars. Throughout the history of Clash of Clans, there have been plenty of armies like this. Different metas, different town hall levels, but the same result and strategies that dominated simply because they were easy to use. And that's exactly what we're looking at today. I've picked 5 armies that required the least amount of skill in the entire history of Clash of Clans. We'll break down why they were considered no skill, how they took over their respective metas, and by the end, we'll decide which one truly deserves the title of the lowest skill army of all time. So, let's get into it. We're starting with one that every OG player instantly remembers: Masked Dragons at Town Hall 7 and 8. Back in the early days of Clash, this was the ultimate spam strategy. Dragons weren't just strong, they felt special, they were expensive, intimidating, and absolutely terrifying when you saw a full army of them flying toward your base. Even in the clan castle, dragons were a nightmare to deal with. Masked dragons became ridiculously strong during this era, largely because the game simply wasn't prepared for them. There were no air sweepers, air defenses were limited, and base designs hadn't evolved enough to counter full air spam. And while masked dragons have stayed relevant at almost every town hall level since then, this specific period is where the strategy truly earned its reputation. The reason masked dragons was considered no skill is simple. It was pure brute force. You didn't need advanced funneling, you didn't need precise troop placement. Pathing barely mattered. In most cases, you just dropped all your dragons in a line and watched the base disappear. Maybe you used lightning spells to remove 1 or 2 air defenses, but beyond that, the strategy practically played itself. If a base didn't have maxed air defenses, or if those air defenses were badly positioned, the dragons would just steamroll everything. 3 stars felt inevitable. Compared to ground attacks at the time, which required careful wall breaking, timing, and troop management, dragons felt like a complete cheat code. Walls actually mattered back then for ground armies, which made dragons feel even more broken. They ignored walls entirely, flew straight over the base, and deleted defenses with raw damage and high health. That contrast made masked dragons feel unfairly strong. These days, masked dragons at higher town halls usually require more effort. You're often doing hero walks, setting up proper funnels, and carefully managing spells. But back then, none of that was necessary. The strategy was incredibly straightforward. Typical attack was simple. You'd bring mostly dragons, sometimes a few balloons, and usually lightning spells, with rage and heal spells also being common. Before deploying anything, you'd use your lightning spells to take out 1 air defense, almost always the one your dragons would reach last. Then you'd drop 2 dragons on opposite corners to create a very basic funnel. Once the outside buildings were cleared, you'd spam the rest of your dragons in a line between those corners. The dragons would naturally move toward the center, melt through defenses, and wipe out the base. There was no complex timing, no trap awareness, and no real decision-making during the attack. The hardest choice was deciding which air defense to zap, and even that decision was obvious most of the time. At Town Hall 7, where there were only 3 air defenses, this strategy was completely broken, and at Town Hall 8 it was still incredibly forgiving. Even bad execution usually resulted in at least 2 stars, which is why it never truly felt skill-based. Eventually, masked dragons started to fall off as Town Hall levels increased, air defenses became stronger, and the air sweeper was introduced, which heavily impacted air spam. Still, the strategy never fully disappeared. In fact, it's made a comeback at top town halls recently when combined with dragon riders. But nothing compares to how simple and dominant it was during this early era. Now, sticking with dragons, we need to talk about Electro Dragon Spam, which is arguably the most infamous no-skill strategy to ever exist in Clash of Clans. Even though its peak didn't last very long, Electro Dragons were introduced with the Town Hall 12 update, and almost immediately they became the most complained about troop in the entire game. Their dominance peaked between Town Halls 11 and 12 and started to decline at Town Hall 13. But those 2 Town Hall levels alone were enough to make Electro Dragon Spam legendary and hated. What made Electro Dragons so powerful was their chain lightning attack. Each strike could jump across multiple buildings, dealing massive damage to clustered bases. On top of that, Electro Dragons had very high health and moved slower than normal dragons. That slower speed actually helped them stay grouped together, making their chain attacks even more effective. The strategy itself couldn't be simpler. You line up your Electro Dragons, drop them all at once, Use a few rage or freeze spells, and watch as huge sections of the base disappear. Funnel requirements were minimal, and even when the attack went wrong, you were almost always guaranteed a 2-star. What made Electro Dragon spam especially frustrating for defenders was how universal it was. It worked against almost every base design. The main counter was spreading buildings far apart, but even then, Electro Dragons could still get insane value and destroy large portions of the base. During this time, a huge part of the community absolutely hated the strategy. Players constantly complained that it required zero skill and was ruining wars. Calls for nerfs were everywhere, and some players even wanted Electro Dragons removed from the game entirely. Ironically, Electro Dragons never received a true nerf. Instead, they were later given small buffs to speed and health. The reason for this is simple. While many players hated Electro Dragon spam, just as many loved it. It made Clash far more accessible for casual players who didn't want to spend hours learning complex attacks. They just wanted to log in, attack, and have fun. And Electro Dragons allowed them to do exactly that. Thankfully, this dominance was mostly limited to Town Halls 11 and 12. Beyond that point, defenses scaled better, and Electro Dragons required much more care to use effectively. At higher levels, other strategies became stronger alternatives. But at Town Hall, 18 Electro Dragons are making a comeback. Let's see if they can even match half the dominance they had at Town Hall 11 and 12. Next up, we have Witch Slap at Town Hall 9, a strategy that completely exploded in popularity around mid-2017. After receiving multiple buffs, witches became absurdly strong, and Witch Slap dominated wars for nearly an entire year. The name alone tells you everything you need to know. You weren't carefully planning attacks, you were literally slapping witches onto the base. What made Witch Slap so strong and so low skill was the sheer number of units involved. Each witch constantly spawned skeletons, creating endless tanks that distracted defenses. With multiple witches on the field and healers keeping them alive, the base was flooded with skeletons that overwhelmed everything. Placement barely mattered. You'd drop witches on two sides with healers, and they'd clear the entire outer ring of the base on their own. Meanwhile, your kill squad would move through the center. Every attack looked almost identical, regardless of base design. That consistency is what made the strategy so frustrating to face. It worked on nearly every base, and there wasn't much defenders could do about it. Even the builder base experienced a similar problem with Night Witch spam. For a long time, witches defined the meta because of how strong and forgiving they were. Next, we have Baby Dragon spam for farming, which is a bit different from the others. This wasn't really a war strategy, it was the ultimate no-brain farming method from around 2016 to 2019. Baby dragons were added in May 2016, and players quickly realized how perfect they were for farming. They trained fast, cost very little elixir, and required absolutely zero thought to use. There was no strategy involved, no planning, no concern for base layouts. You'd simply drop baby dragons, sometimes with a few balloons, all around the base in a circle. They'd clear collectors and storages with ease, because baby dragons enrage when they're alone. Spreading them out randomly was actually the correct way to use them. That meant you couldn't even deploy them incorrectly. In many ways, this was even more brainless than Barch, since you didn't have to worry about walls or splash damage. Eventually, this strategy faded away. Loot became easier to obtain, training costs were removed, and sneaky goblins were introduced. At that point, baby dragon farming just didn't make sense anymore. Finally, we have Barge, one of the most iconic spam strategies in Clash of Clans history. While it was mainly a farming army, it was also surprisingly effective in normal attacks. Barge deserves a spot on this list because it was simple, effective, and iconic. You'd either dump barbarians and archers around the entire base, or deploy them in waves from one side to avoid splash damage early on. It was chaotic, fun, and easy to use, which is exactly why it became so popular. So now that we've looked at 5 of the most famous no-skill armies in Clash of Clans history, which one truly takes the crown? If we're judging purely on skill floor, Electro Dragon spam is easily the lowest skill army on this list. You drop everything at once, usually in a straight line, and spell usage is extremely forgiving. Other strategies at least require some timing or positioning. Electro Dragons don't. On top of that, it's also the most hated strategy the game has ever seen, largely because of how little skill it takes to use effectively. For that reason, Electro Dragon spam absolutely deserves the #1 spot. But let me know what you think down in the comments. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you all in the next one.